We're going live. And hello, everybody. How we doing? I am here at a special date and time for a special enterprise data health review with two of my favorite thinkers in the enterprise, and you're going to know why in just a few minutes. Maureen and Alyx are here. How we doing?
Fabulous.
Thanks, John.
Well, this is going to be a good one. If you're in the stream, you will start seeing it on LinkedIn, and please comment to let me know that you're there. And there is an alternate YouTube stream if LinkedIn poses any problems, but hopefully it will not. Okay, enterprise data health. Well, so look, folks, this is one of the most critical issues that you can think of in the enterprise right now. There's, I think, the garbage in, garbage out aspects of AI are pretty well understood at this point, but there is a whole lot more to the story. And what we have here today are the co-authors of the most ambitious and arguably the first in-depth study of what enterprise data health really looks like. So we are going to get real today, and I've challenged these two individuals to take us beyond the cliches, because we all know that dirty data is a problem for AI and generally for operational success at any level. And we also know that you can't throw AI at the problem and it can't fix itself. So you can't say, go clean your data, and it won't go do that. It's not going to happen. So we got a much tougher narrative, folks. Anyhow, the ground rules of this show are a little bit different. Oh, we have Josh here. Hi, Josh. Please send your telepathic commentary. I don't know many people who care about dirty data in the enterprise more than Josh. So glad to have you with us. So look, there aren't many rules on my show because you're all part of the show. So please add your comments as you see fit, and we will address them as we go in the most jugular way possible. But there is a little bit of a rule that I've established for this particular show, which is I want to spend about half our time really in the dark despair of data problems and really delineating what the challenges are. And then as we head to the second half of the show, we want to shift a little bit into where do we really go from here? Because one of the most shocking things about this report, in my opinion, is that a lot of the cliched answers about where to go from here are definitely not sufficient. So we're about to find out. And I've asked these folks to give the best surprises and insights from these conversations. But before we do that, we're going to kind of take a step back here a little bit and kind of talk about why this whole project came about. So I'm going to turn it over to the two of you and whoever wants to go first. But, and by the way, this is Alyx's debut on my show and long overdue. So glad you're here. Maureen's kind of a returning champion. So she's been through the fire pit before. Why did you decide to do this? This was a not an easy report. What made you want to do this?
Alyx, we've been having conversations for quite some time about it. One might even say rants in the background. I can't even remember how it started. Do you know?
There were definitely rants, and I think we first started talking about this because we were also experiencing challenges with our own data management. And it was like, all right, what do you use? And I was having a hell of a time and asking you for recommendations. You were doing the same thing. And it was like, all right, let's pull our knowledge. And it kind of went from there.
And it's interesting, Alyx and I coming at it from two different sides. I had kind of been in the depths of it for a decade or so as a B2B tech CMO. And then in building Serendipitus, I'm at the coalface with clients. And so I saw sort of the coalface trends, and Alyx and of course diginomica was seeing the higher level just across so many customers. And that's where we thought we absolutely need to dig into this.
Yeah, I think we'd gotten to the point where it was the same surveys coming out going, yes, data is a problem, and the same individual selling effects. And I think we'd both had it up to the back teeth with that.
So one of the big things that jumped out for me is a quote that you wrote: enterprise data health is far worse than industry benchmarks suggest, and that the market telling organizations to deploy AI faster is the last place they should look for honest answers. Boom. And to me, that really shines through in terms of the problem with our industry is that most of the research is funded by vendors. And I hope folks can appreciate that when you do that, there is some level of self-interest in what the results are going to be, right? Because you find that when a vendor is interested in security, that lo and behold, the research finds that enterprises have security gaps. There's nothing wrong with a lot of this research, but I think in particular with the issue of data quality, we need folks to go in who don't have any preconceived notions about how bad the problem is and to get real, especially because what I think we find is that people don't always know the extent of problems inside their own organization. So, can you all just tell me a little bit about that part of it? Because my sense is that you didn't know exactly where this was going to take you when you embarked upon it, right?
One of the things I think that that Alyx brought to the table, and I confessed this to them halfway through the project, was Alyx kept harping on the no vendor perspective, and I was like, yeah, the no vendor perspective, and not really understanding kind of about that. So Alyx had that mindset from the beginning, and just to jump on your last point, John, you're absolutely right with your perspective. The other piece that we were probably guessing going in, and it became more obvious, was when you ask a bunch of brilliant high-end leaders in a room of other people or via kind of just a survey, how great is the blah, blah, blah? They're going to go, yeah, it's pretty good, especially in a room with their peers. No one's going to admit the truth. And I've been hearing for years that behind the scenes, no one trusts the data. And so it was surprising, and certainly came up from this research, the dichotomy there. And it's Alyx's analysis that really caught fire there. Am I missing anything, Alyx?
I think the fact that we promised complete anonymity and said we wouldn't cite anything, there was no PR involved, we didn't have to prove anybody for quotes, we just said, talk to us, we're not going to tell you anything, tell anybody who we've spoken to. And it was so completely unfiltered that I think people really relaxed into it. And it's really easy to get people talking about the pain points that they're suffering and the amount of detail that just came out. And I was really surprised by the fact that, we just kept reviewing these transcripts and it's like, oh my God, everybody's saying the same thing.
From Fortune 10, Fortune 100 to small to medium-sized businesses, any vertical, largely B2B, but B2C as well, pervasive how universal the exact same problem is.
Yes, another hard-hitting line from the report. You were talking about a utility provider that you spoke with in depth. After years of platform investment, transformation programs, data governance initiatives, it actually couldn't prove to an external body how it had spent its own money. The data wasn't traceable enough to justify its own spending. This is what data dysfunction looks like when it meets an unmovable deadline. There's a lot of stuff like that in the report, and I was really struck by how many sophisticated organizations are still struggling with this. And so my perception of this project is that you were really set free to do this. And, you know, granted, we were thinking about, what will the market think in the end, but we really wanted you to come up with whatever you wanted. And I think that's what stood out to me when I read the report was there was a fierceness behind it to say, we need to wake up and really understand this dynamic. And so today in our show, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the learnings from this. But before we do that, let me just ask you, and by the way, keep the comments going because I still haven't seen too much from LinkedIn, although here's one. Sorry about the anonymity there. We will get to the enterprise data AI connection in this for sure. But can you tell me a little bit about this research, by the way, you can get on Diginomica. You can search for enterprise data health. It'll come up. It's free with sign up. And there's also some blogs you can read about it. What kind of reactions did you get when it came out? Was it what you were expecting? Was it different?
It was not what I was expecting. I was kind of hoping that we would get some good use cases out of it to be able to point to and say, all right, yes, people are struggling, but also here is where the rays of sunshine are. This is where people are doing well. And the biggest thing that got me was the same thing, the fact that you would say to somebody, do you trust your data? And half would say yes. And then you'd say, all right, would you hand your data to that CEO without checking it first? And they'd go, no. And it was the same person in the same conversation, just a couple of minutes apart. And these people aren't lying. They've just stopped noticing exactly how much checking they do. And it's not until those conversations come out that you start to pick it up.
All right. Well, with that context in mind, let's throw down a few surprises from this research that you were struck by. I think you might have kind of touched on one of them already, but give us one of your top three surprises from this.
Well, one of them for me was, having spent 10 years as a B2B tech CMO, and what those weeks are like, but the value of human collaboration, and stay with me. Alyx and I had structured, trusted, clean, new data. And the value of our collaboration was mind-blowing. The patterns that Alyx saw that I might have missed, and the talking about things and double checking. And what struck me is that organizations and senior leaders do not have time in the normal course of business to have that kind of collaboration with trusted data. They don't have great data, there's no time to collaborate. So that was really profound for me that Alyx and I had that as a part of this project, and it made me sad for the market.
The other thing that stood out to me was the fact that we also got kind of caught with this, because we did every interview and coded each of the survey results ourselves. We knew what we were looking for and still overread the trust to some extent. And we ended up having to go back and correct our own scoring in 7 out of 8 cases. So if two people who built the study up around knowing exactly what it was structured for, then how on earth is a survey respondent who is clicking through stuff in 90 seconds about their data going to be able to really genuinely talk about their pain points that they're experiencing, because they don't even have time to realize it.
And to me, that was a great catch on Alyx's part. It was just such a great, I'll try not to fangirl Alyx too much, but it was such great collaboration. And I had gone back in and looked at kind of the RAG scoring. And that's where we went back and forth on it a little bit and corrected it. So the tools that we had did a pretty good job, but not a great job. And I just think about the parallel in market where you might have a customer success or customer health score, because you've just got old patterns, imperfect tech, some tech that's doing great, but it's just such an imperfect system without that human eye on it. That was just such a brilliant realization that Alyx had.
Yeah, but you got them talking, Maureen. It was, I think you really felt for those people, and that empathy came across as they were sharing their experiences.
One thing I think I would also like to emphasize here is that while I think there can be value in big quantitative surveys, I think there's also value in what you did, which was very, very deep, in-depth discussions, very candid, very off the record, because a lot of these bigger quantified surveys in the enterprise are really just checking boxes. And like you said, in this case, that would not have worked because they would have checked the boxes saying our data health is pretty good, right? And it wasn't until that kind of honest probing that you got into a deeper, I think, truth, and honestly, a more difficult truth. But this is something that I think vendors struggle a lot with in the enterprise, which is, you think of it like any kind of self-improvement effort. You have to start with a clear snapshot. Otherwise, you're just delusional. And that's the problem I see with change in our industry, is that we're not willing to take a moment and say how difficult the current situation is. And ironically, that's the key to a better path, in my opinion. I want to call attention to Chris Gaither here in the comments. Chris on LinkedIn has been pretty much ruthlessly addressing data related problems pertaining to AI. And Chris, we will get back to some of that later in the show as well. Chris says it seems that enterprise data has always lacked the connective tissue required for it to wholly represent organizational and operational reality, resulting in the institutionalizing of the compensated efforts of human employees. A messy picture.
It's a messy picture indeed. And thanks for using the word human. Because at one point I told Alyx, I actually confessed, these people that we interviewed, like, I could cry. I loved them. And it was all I could do to not end phone calls with, oh my God, I love you. Because these are deeply experienced, educated human beings that care about the businesses that they're serving. And they are saddled with the most insane, terrible cobbling of data and their teams. And there are no solutions to date to address that. The solutions we're doing aren't working. And so just a shout out to these people we interviewed who are like, their peers around the world, just working hard to do great work. And it's in nearly impossible circumstances.
Not to mention the seniority of these people. Sorry, John.
Yeah, go
these
ahead,
are people running like billion-pound programs, and they're spending a third to two-thirds of their time just checking numbers by hand. And they're being punished for, having to do that, which is inherently such a structural and ongoing problem that people just don't see anymore.
One of the phrases that jumped out when we were having our show notes was this notion of the verification tax. And you reminded me of it just now with our conversation. And we just published a piece on diginomica it's from Sage Research, and this is more about AI related verification tax, but it's not too different in the end. It's this notion that we want AI systems to be trustworthy, but if we're spending all of our times verifying output and data, then where are we really in terms of process improvement, team collaboration, ROI? We'll throw that in there too. Why not? Getting results from our investments. How do you think about the verification tax in the context of your research?
So that was one of the things. I didn't call it the verification tax. Again, Alyx, I think, was probably one of the first ones in market, I think, to coin that related to data. We're hearing a little bit about it with AI, but all of us who have been, working for a couple decades or more have been feeling this verification tax when it comes to data. And of course, if we've got this muddled situation with data, AI only compounds that. So while we talk about trust in AI, which is another way to say verification tax, AI is not going to work unless we look at the data foundations to begin with. And we're nowhere near close to solving for that. One of the things, this would be another surprise for me. So Alyx's follow-up blog piece to the research was, we got terrific feedback from like ServiceNow, Certinia, Celonis, several others, just about how spot on the research was. And the blog, which is so great for anyone who wants to read it, is called "The Data is Broken and Everyone Knows It." And yet, around the world, people are like 4-year-olds around a soccer ball. We're just trying to fix this terrible data as opposed to looking up and trying to find what other options we might have.
There's also the issue that I think one of the responses that came back in that blog was that data silos are also, designed to empower certain people as well. Information is power. Knowledge has an awful lot of weight. And the more you have access to that knowledge and being able to gatekeep it, the better the advantage that you have. And I was really pleased that one of the respondents pointed that out from their own perspective, because it is true. And a lot of this comes back to culture, not just technology.
Totally agree with that. It's one of my big mantras at the moment is what kind of AI do you want to have mantra. And I think there's some real forks in the road. I was talking with Raju Vijizna from Zoho for a podcast. I don't know if this part will come in the podcast because we talk for a long ass time, but one of the things I said to him when he was talking about the culture of experimentation and the energizing way that AI has helped them with that, I was like, yeah, but keep in mind, you've created a culture around what you do that creates that trust. Without that, why are people going to want to collaborate? Why are they going to want to share the one thing that they feel distinguishes themselves inside their organization? Why do they want to become a part of a digital exhaust framework that pulls that from them, without any sense of recognition or even job stability, right? And so I think you totally hit that in this report around the cultural aspects. So for those of you who joined a bit late, we're kind of painting a real reality check here. We are going to talk about solutions as well. I just want you to know, I think it's important for us to take some actions away from that. And those of you in the chat, I'm going to push you a little bit on that topic as well. So please start chiming in. We have a couple of questions. Maureen and Alyx, I want to shift into those three personas thing in a sec. So just to FYI on that, but let's go through a couple of questions first, or comments. To trust a number, there's no other way than to do sanity check by hand. That's an interesting comment. And I would say, and we can have a more robust conversation about verification, but there are ways of running verification checks on certain kinds of numbers automatically as well. But that doesn't mean that that's a complete trust. But anyway, we'll get back to that. Uh, and Chris, you want to get into some of the solutions? Yeah. Well, we're not quite there yet. So, like I said, we will get there. I agree. It's not quite as dark a picture as we're currently portraying, but I just want to start there. So, okay. So the other thing that you all uncovered for me, like in our show notes, were the three different victims of AI hype. So tell me about these three different victims.
Over to you, Alyx.
Okay, so the first victim is the ones who are losing out because they are cautious. So the cautious ones that won't deploy and get punished for being honest about it. Then you've got the builder organization that ships on shaky data and then builds an AI control tower to try and babysit the mess that it made. And then you've got the regulated organization that is stuck with an internal tool that one of them probably calls prehistoric, and someone in our study did do that.
Right. So the cautious organization, the building things on precarious foundations kind of reminds me of those articles you see about New York City buildings that are like leaning that can't be occupied and stuff. Not a good result. And it's always like, what was the architect thinking? Uh, and then the regulated, in the pressure cooker of regulations. Yeah, those are three different ways to go down, huh?
Very much so. I mean, we talked about all aspects of this with people, and we found that governance narrowed the gap, but didn't close it. But even with like 10 years of AI investment, they still couldn't trust half of what came from the team next door. And nobody scored higher than those ones. So they found that they got the governance, they had deployed the AI, but they still weren't able to collaborate over it effectively. So they might have one person said, we have 1 billion Power BI reports. So the trust in what they were seeing was, even though they built it, was still hard to come by. And if nobody's able to really fundamentally trust that information, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, whether you spend the money or whether you decide to cobble together what you have. If you don't have the confidence, then you're totally stuffed.
Sherry Ann asks, can you run verification checks real time so this concept of real time autonomous agents actually works? Hi, Sherry Ann, another vocal enterprise voice that I love to run into on LinkedIn. Uh, that's a big can of worms, Sherry Ann. Chris, feel free to comment on that in the chat. My opinion is only to a point. But yes, there are things you can do to run verifications, but I don't think that is a shortcut to trying to get data quality right from the beginning either. It's kind of a combination. So we'll get into a little bit of the broader question of real time organizational truth towards the end of this uh, show. So anything else you all want to air out in terms of problems and obstacles? I know we're going to revisit the three personas on the way as well in terms of how they might evolve. But anything else you wanted to lay out while we kind of wallow in the despair of broken enterprises?
Well, one of the reasons why I don't see healthy solutions to address this in market today is because nearly all vendors and all corporations are cobbling together via legacy data. Like we've got, our digital infrastructure was invented, roughly around the time Salesforce was born, predicated on the tech before that. That's never worked. So we're riddled with point solutions, just band-aided over everything, creating the most insane data. If you've never looked at the reports from any of the functional areas, so I would talk about the market intelligence layer, product marketing, sales, and success. The data categories are insane. I will argue that we are better off just getting rid of this and starting new. And we'd be so much better off because we've been trying to do digital transformation for what, 15 years now? Hey, Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Another acerbic voice. Welcome. Gosh, we attracted all the great outlier voices today. Hi, Brian. Great to see you. By the way, Brian and I are going to have a gangbuster show in a week, so a little bit later than this. So come back for the Enterprise Month in Review. Still working on a special guest for that. I have an invite out. Okay, Chris Gaither's jumping in here. Chris, thank you for jumping in, responding to Sherry Ann. Complete verification of the model layer will require mechanistic interpretability, which we have not figured out yet. And the data layer, on the other hand, is another story. Yeah, there is some hope on the data layer for this. But anyhow, we will get into that a little bit further. I do want to shift gears a little bit into kind of where organizations can go from here. On Diginomica, we do have a number of stories that I think are compelling. I don't think they present total solutions to this problem, but especially in a large enterprise segment. I just did a judging round on data decisions for Constellation Research, and the data to decisions use cases were pretty good. But I'll explain a little bit the characteristics of what I saw as winning solutions. But one thing I wanted to mention first is I spent a fair amount of time in the cloud ERP mid market, and one really interesting thing about the smaller companies is I've done use cases with some of them where they will talk about getting to a single source of truth. And what's really cool is it establishes proof points for me in terms of what that looks like organizationally. The problem is that large enterprises can't snap their fingers and experience that because they have way too much inherited gobbledygook. And by the way, they're just one merger and acquisition away from screwing up that pursuit all over again. But in smaller, more niche enterprises that have really taken a disciplined move to a cloud ERP type operational framework, you run into this, and it's really interesting to study them. And Maureen, you and I had an interview with someone who sort of resembled that, and it was interesting to hear them talk a little bit more about, yeah, things are kind of working for me. And so what happens in those environments, just very quickly, is that users come into meetings questioning the numbers, but then they find out that the numbers are actually accurate. And it saves them so much stress once they start to realize, actually, the numbers in this new cloud ERP system are actually accurate for me. And they start realizing they can make decisions based on those numbers, and what a relief it is not to fight over those numbers anymore. Anyway, I'm just saying that it's interesting to do those smaller use cases with smaller companies because you realize a little bit of the art of the possible. Now, granted, it's not all data. It's just certain operational data, but it's really cool to see that, yeah, you can do that. The problem is you can't take that into a large enterprise setting and say, well, why can't you do that? It's just not possible.
One thing I would also add to that is the flag about decision-making processes. And every either executive or customer that I have interviewed over the last few months has always come back to the process workflow and how you map your processes out before you even touch it with technology. And it is where so many fall down before they've even got started. So I think that decision-making process and what that looks like varies obviously between organization and organization, but the less collaborative or transparent it is, the more challenging it's going to be.
I went to a vendor conference this spring, and I'm not going to say which one, but I went to a few where I posed as a customer. So I'm kind of outing myself here that I do this. So I go to workshops, right? And I hang out with customers, and we like talk about agentic, but how to get there. And Diginomica, we have our own share of data problems. Alyx could tell you about that. So I have things to share too. And what I thought was so fascinating in some of these discussions was how they really acknowledge, like, the customers I was sitting with at these things. Yeah, like, these agents would work really great if we could get rid of these silos. And so the vendor would ask them, well, how would you like to just move forward? And they were like, I would love to, but we don't have the level of organizational buy-in necessary to do that. They wanted nothing more to go on a plane, get home, and start working on these problems. But they felt that they couldn't because they didn't have the political influence to do it. I just thought that was so interesting.
One of the things that came up that I think was a surprise was how much the financial data in an organization is trusted, because there are financial models that have been around for decades. And if you don't follow them, you have, ouchy things will happen to you. But as one of our interviewers said, or interviewees said, the rest of the organization is the Wild West. And I was talking to a CFO last week who was really like, why can't they agree on a data model? And while I think there are some troublesome people in organizations, there's also just an inability because of the silos to find something that people can agree on, which is a thing I'm looking at separately. But it is actually really hard by themselves to agree on a data model that works for parts of the organization that are not regulated.
There's a real challenge around linguistics as well. And John, I think you've touched on this so many times in different other aspects of technology. But one person's name for something does not mean the same thing, even within internally in an organization. It's a bit like guardrails. It means different things to everybody. And there'll be some vendors who go, yeah, we've put guardrails on it. But in actual fact, when you push them back on the detail, you get very little back. And having those guardrails and the governance, I think, has been a real advantage for financial departments, like Maureen said.
Yeah, and then you get into companies with more complex manufacturing operations, and once you head out into shop floors and production environments, it starts to get really, really ugly. Uh, Sherry Ann has seen me in disguise. Yeah, Sharon, please don't blow my cover, okay? Because I got to keep going to these customer workshops. Uh, so, Chris, I want to segue into a couple of your comments as we tentatively move towards some solutions so that people can take a few things back to their projects here. Chris says, so many organizations see enterprise data, especially ERP, as non tanger. I'm going to need a translation there. It's a huge career liability to try to improve the stack, no matter how badly it may need it. So, in other words, outlining a little more of the problem statement. And then I want to get your responses to Chris's last comment. Chris is also kind of out in the field with this, like you, Maureen. I hear a lot of no solution available, nowhere near solving this. That's not entirely true. Viable solutions get buried in the noise, discounted as vibe coding slop, or blackballed by an ecosystem that knows a working system threatens their revenue model. I would know having built one that I can't seem to sell. I think there is some truth to that, Chris, that in some ways business as usual benefits incumbents and doesn't solve problems. Maureen, have you seen that in your line of work?
Well, yeah, so I can relate to Chris there. So I do think it's a little more complicated than that. My position is that if you've got foundational legacy tech and you've got point solutions that integrate with that legacy tech, and you're not willing to look at anything that isn't legacy infused data, so even emerging tech that is being deployed has to connect to the existing legacy systems. So we're just compounding in a very miserable way all this legacy stuff that, again, if you look at the reports, you'll see how useless most of this is. An NPS report has like 30 columns, all useless. NPS, I would say, is useless anyway. But so I would say that I don't see organizations actively looking at how they can get away from the legacy perspective. I don't just mean old systems. The tech is the data is hard coded in. So I don't think there are many viable solutions to solve for it that aren't connected to legacy infrastructure that is just way past its prime.
Cool. How about we talk a little bit about how we would? Chris is translating the Latin for me. Was do not touch, by the way. Seems appropriate. Uh, how would we advise customers? Let's say we have a customer. Maybe they don't have total executive buy-in because that may be a pipe dream, but let's say they have some buy-in within their department of their region to take some decisive steps forward here. What kinds of things are we seeing that would create some encouragement here, knowing that you can't just sprinkle the AI pixie dust onto this as the way forward.
Alyx, why don't you start there?
I did some homework and decided to do a little bit of testing myself a couple months ago after doing some AI research of my own after coming back from an event. And I built the kind of search engine that AI answer tools use. And I tested it on around nearly 7,000 of our own articles. And it got an accuracy score of 0.97% out of 1. And that tells me that the content wasn't the problem, but the AI, as long as it has clean access to really good content and not just a shit ton of content that is just everything that you can throw at it, your retrieval is going to be sound. But the thing that trips it up was having, I think one of the things that I did was look for a definitive article on a topic. And it came up lower down because the headline didn't match how a person would ask an AI about it. And that, to me, kind of gives me a big picture of the challenges that people are facing and what they have to get right first before they do something, just on a really small scale. Work out exactly what your data is that you really need to work from, and then build that into a project. Scope it out fully. And if you've got the opportunity to invest, document everything, because otherwise you're not going to be able to go back and try and understand what went wrong if you don't get the results that you're looking for.
Yeah, and tangibly, particularly in the market intelligence space, so B2B, product marketing, sales, and success, it is so much easier than we think it might be to get those organizations to collaborate by working hard to get the tech to serve the business. What does the business need? How do we need to set the tech up to serve the business? Today, the business serves the tech. What is the tech capable of doing? Okay, we'll do that, and then we'll just divine and cobble. But if we take a little bit of time, not much, maybe a couple months, to have a look at the workflows of what do we need to know from the market and all the channels and acquisition, expansion, retention at every touch point, how can we structure some data, small at the beginning, and then you can compound healthy data? And the benefit there is you start getting compounding healthy data that enables you to start to draw down some of the point solutions, free up some budget for companies like Chris, and just start to get data that's trustworthy, that everyone agrees with, and it's just 1 or 2 degrees of separation from how it was created. And we do not have that today. So, and then when you think about that clean data, to Sherry Ann's question, then you can start to do some agentic work that's working with clean data that are running their plays and then updating the healthy data model to then run the next play. It's possible, but we're just so tied. We're just so frogs in hot water in the enterprise space that it's really hard to get our heads above.
Yeah, so I have a couple of different takes on sort of the good news side of this. So I'll throw a couple of them out there and you all can react to them. One of them is that while I think AI can create a lot of organizational, like essentially a new obstacle in terms of the oppressiveness of what are we doing with AI or AI first, I think it can also create renewed willingness to take a harder look at these problems with data and process that we really should have been, when you look at it, we should have been working harder on these for a long time, right? I think that point has come up in the chat many times. I think there's a chance to take advantage of a little bit of that momentum. Now, granted, it takes some education because a lot of the executives who feel the AI momentum, I think, have been oversold on the simplicity of what they played around with Claude on the side and how responsive it is, and they think they can just that's going to work for regulated, governed workflows. So there's some education there, but I do think there's an opportunity, and the way I kind of think about it is starting with an area where you do have some quality and data discipline and starting to work out scenarios there so that, to Alex's point, you can actually see a, a level of significant improvement in what you can do with not just AI, but any kind of analytics or predictive tech, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't have to be agents. When you can see what it can do with more quality data. And I think there's a minimum viable like data that is needed for that. And it really depends. So you want to pick an area that's kind of pretty well bounded. So for an example that I've seen is things around like uh creating kind of a self-service model for payroll and benefits information, right? Because that's a very focused source of data. And one of the reasons why I'm an advocate for SaaS and not a SaaS is dead person is because some of the discipline of modern software is part of what forces data quality to happen. uh, and so that's just one example, I think, of where you can find some quality data. So use it in a domain that's much more bounded, where you don't need a bunch of real time data sources, for example, which is not the strength of the current technology. I'll get into that in a moment. Uh, but find an area that's a little more bounded and build on that. But I think it's like a parallel track thing, right? Which is you're going to have to show wins with the quality data, but then also to think about what does it look like when this proliferates, right? What would a modern data platform look like so that okay, we're building one self-service agent or analytics tool, but eventually there's going to be 50 of them or 100 of them or 1,000 of them, and they're going to need to coexist in a governed space that makes sense. So I do think you have to tackle big picture issues, but I do think there's an opportunity to notch some wins here. And, we see that in diginomica use cases all the time. So it's not just doom and gloom, but I think it is still hard. Reactions from the guests, please.
I think it's a lot of doom and gloom if you talk to people in enterprise. And one of the things again that both Alyx and the Diginomica team, as we were building the research before we started interviewing, really wanted us to ask some organizational design questions. And that is it culture, is it the tech? And uh, a lot of blank stares on the organizational design questions. Again, I think this is just a problem that is coming from organizations doing more and more and more, never taking anything off their plates. No one has any time for strategic thinking. It's just whip the horse, until it's, midnight before a board meeting or a C-suite meeting. And you're just, the data is just what the data is. And then you try again the next, it's really, people are exhausted.
People are exhausted, but I think one of the conclusions that has come from both the research and from conversations since then has been that you really need to try and apply a bit of a forcing function voluntarily to maybe like 2 or 3 data sets that are going to drive decisions. And it's the decision part that is the key thing. So you've got to name an owner, you've got to set expectations, and there's got to be consequences around it, because it's all very well and good going, yeah, we put some data into this tool and look, it's working really well. If it's not going to have an impact that is going to influence a senior leader, then it's going to be much harder to get it over the line. The other thing that I would say is that it's easy to run 2 programs at the same time. So you'll find with large organizations that everybody has a data transformation section in one corner, and then they've got a restructure in another, and nobody is connecting the 2 things. And one of the cheapest things available would be putting those 2 teams in a room, because you don't need a budget, you don't need procurement, you don't need a sponsor. They just need to be able to talk to each other. I once ran, in a previous lifetime, a departmental strategy day when 3 different departments had been brought together after a restructure. And one of the biggest things that we did was just to put the basics of the departmental strategic plan up on a screen and say, all right, this is what everybody is supposed to be working towards. How are individual teams actually working towards being able to deliver that? And what are the measures that you use to be able to define that? And it was so lovely to see that people started talking to each other at the event, because they hadn't realized that they were both coming at the same thing from completely different directions and didn't know what another part of the organization really does, because they never get the chance to talk to each other. I don't think it's necessarily all gatekeeping. I think there's a need for facilitation.
And to Sherry Ann's question here, no one is going to stop to clean up their data 100%, which is why organizations, C-suite boards I don't think I don't think Benioff understands how many hundreds of people are getting data together for his ops teams meetings or tweaking his exec dashboards. And until the light bulb goes off for those folks, we're going to be in the same rat race, because it is far easier to start to sandbox some new ways of looking at data so that we don't have to clean data. We're not executing reports that are coded the way they were when some of this tech was invented. That we're saying, no way, the tech needs to serve the business, and here's how we need to structure it. And then cleaning data doesn't become a thing. It just becomes trustworthy with few tweaks here and there and some collaboration.
So I'll throw out some more good news. Well, let's see, good news. Positive momentum, shall we say?
Positive momentum.
Yeah, some positive momentum. It ties back a little bit to what Sherry-Ann just said about the difficulty with this latest industrial revolution. We now have data that is difficult to unwind and correct. We must trust but verify when using AI. Agents will need to be tested thoroughly with data. No one is going to stop to clean up their data. A couple of things I want to point out there. One of which, Sherry-Ann, is that if you're with an organization that's rushing to build autonomous agents, they need to just friggin' stop. Like, agents don't have to be autonomous. They can be personal assistants as well. We could argue over the semantics, but the point is, there's no need to rush to autonomy prematurely. But the second, if you all have like a cup of coffee at your side and you want to read my real-time organizational truth post that I wrote, it's about 3,000 words. One things I get into in there is how enterprise AI is evolving and essentially putting the LLM part of the activity in a more constrained setting and emphasizing the context that goes in, which is the better data. And part of that is the explainability piece, Sherry-Ann, because part of what goes on there is with context, LLMs are basically black boxes. I don't care what anyone wants to justify around their reasoning, traces, and explanations. It's just crap. They don't know what they do. They just do what they do. But the context that goes in can be traced directly to particular sources for verification purposes. And so part of the journey here is about explainability and about transparency. And, Alyx has written awesome pieces on diginomica about observability in general. And I think we need to adapt observability principles to how we manage our data and not to create dark data pipelines, but use this technology as a chance to expose them so that we can constantly impose quality control mechanisms on that data throughout the process. Anyway, so that's part of the good news. But I think the other good news is kind of Chris is backing me up on the organizational truth. Like that's the real passionate pursuit, I think, is what that looks like. And so part of the whiteboard opportunity here that I'm excited about is rethinking how decisions are made, because one of the strengths of these new technologies is building a so-called context layer where you can incorporate different aspects of data that are important that were never really contained very effectively in enterprise systems to begin with. And now a lot of people pushed back on this and said, well, John, you're writing science fiction right now, because I listed like 15 different components of what organizational truth could look like. Everything from, sentiment data to semantic business rules and all of that logic and all this stuff and teams chats or whatever. Fine. But the point is you can do it gradually too. And so I'll give you two examples. One was, this happened to be a vendor. I'm not going to call them out because I don't want to do vendor shout out here, but basically they built a shipping intelligent agent that pulls in tariff data. So totally external data, real-time data, which LLMs don't have organically. They match it to shipments at sea, pulled in container tracking data, and then proactively recommended actions to the customer. And that's in concert with the enterprise layer, which in this case was ERP. So it's combining ERP and shipments data. So it's not totally whiteboard because it's just two new components combined, but that's really interesting. And I'm about to do a piece on Aeropuertas, an Argentinian airline airport management, and how they're incorporating agentic real-time weather information and all kinds of runway and sensor data into making better real-time management decisions around a critical issue, which is the safety of planes on snow-laden airports. So that's a really cool, interesting use case. How it will pan out, we will find out, because Argentina is just now getting into winter. So, which seems really weird to me because I'm like boiling right now in the heat. But anyway, they're in winter. So we're tracking this right now. But anyway, the point being, like, there's really imaginative and interesting things that can be done. But granted, you can't boil the ocean with this stuff. You have to, as much as I would like it to be a total whiteboard, you have to pick something that's going to succeed, because no one really has patience right now for my whiteboard organizational design activities. So anyway.
Well, and John, I think you make a really good point about how much of a spectrum AI and agentic and what's going on. And I think these use cases that have a tangible product, like they've probably got some sort of measurement for the heat and the run, that is actually new data, new categorizing of data. They might have some legacy, like what's the temperature been over the past whatever decade. But a lot of that, the robotic stuff, is like net new. And so enterprise is dealing with archaic, corroded data. Nothing is new. And I think we need to be a little more inspired by the opportunities of creating new data sets based on today's reality. And I think we're just all talking about AI too broadly to make those cases. So I love cases like that, because it's also a case for creating a net new model.
Right. And it's the power of these disparate data sources coming together to form a closer picture of reality. And until we get that, we're not going to be successful. And agents are going to suck too, because they're going to seem really brilliant until they totally disappoint us. And my infamous red mouse example, right, where my mouse indicator light, Google Gemini, with all of its trillions of training data, had the wrong answer for me about my mouse, and I wasted an hour trying to figure it out. And it was all about lacking a crucial piece of real-time information. And enterprises are like that too. And so I think this imagination around these new data sets, combined with some quality data from, operational systems, is really interesting. And I would like to see more organizations get momentum from that, because these are hard problems that we've talked about today. And I really respect the two of you for not sugarcoating any of this, because every vendor wants to put a spin on this. And I don't think that's where we're going to get from here to a better place.
Yeah, it's the vendor spin, and it's also, I sat in on an analyst briefing, a very respected boutique analyst firm, talking about some of these topics, and I asked them behind the scenes, is this all self-reported stuff? Oh, they're doing all these amazing things. Did you verify that? And they're saying, no, it's self-reported. Well, the other thing we have to keep in mind is what people say they're doing and what they're actually doing. There's a whole lot of runway between that.
Yeah. Isn't it kind of funny with all our attempts to quantify things? And I don't know about you, Alex, you've been to a number of shows, but for me, it's all the field test. I can tell when a customer is doing dynamic, powerful things and when they're not, just by how they talk about their project. And it's pretty rare to run into someone who's really firing on all cylinders. I don't care what the data shows, and I don't care what customers vendors put in front of me. There's only a small percentage that really have that energizing feeling where they really feel like they're heading in the right direction. Like you said, Maureen, having the right kind of team collaboration, feeling recognized and respected inside their organization. It's wonderful when you have those, but they just don't happen that often. We have a little bit of a World Cup shout out here. I don't want to get too distracted by that, but yeah, I knew that I would somehow get around to Lionel Messi in this chat. It just seemed inevitable. Chris, I want to pick up on the back and forth here again. Responding to Sherry Ann, that's a common sense approach, but you don't need to trust or verify input from any user, human or AI. If your system of record knows your business rules and treats every input as adversarial until it's validated against them at commit time. And yeah, that's one of the keys to better real-time data is the notion that you would verify against your trusted data sets. And that's a whole different show that we're not going to have time to go for today, because I often run long, but I have a hard stop today, kind of hard. So anyhow, where are the two of you at? Where do you feel we've gone? Have we missed something? Where's your head at the end of this discussion?
Alex is always more reasoned.
I don't know about reasoned actually. I'm quite vehement on this one. I think there's an awful lot of very expensive software being sold right now on the promise that it's going to fix things, and that has been true for a long time. But the noise is getting louder, and a lot of those promises only work on data that the buyer doesn't actually have, and nobody is charging any less for the buyers who aren't in that position. In fact, they're charging more when they need to be of more assistance. I think the market as a whole sells these tools and stays very quiet about the prerequisites. And that, I think, is also some responsibility on us in terms of the analysis and journalism that is done. And are we really pushing back on the claims that are being made here rather than just championing ones that come out of a vendor, sponsored use case? There are people actively suffering burning out because they are incredibly smart at what they do. They know their data, and yet they're having to work God knows how many hours to be able to justify what they do to people who are more senior than them, and it's not their fault. They're being actively punished for this.
Yeah, and I would just love to know when the C-suite and the board will stop believing all the tech promises and beating their people up and start to drive digging in to why are we 15 years in to transformations that don't work, and now we're starting, this AI era, and that's not going very well. And where is the curiosity about the root cause and how to be better?
Sherry Ann, thank you for joining, and she wants to thank your guests for the stimulating discussion. I'm really glad you were a part of it. I knew as soon as I saw your name, you were going to bring some good stuff in here. So thank you, and great to see you. So Maureen, I'm going to add another dimension to that, and it ties back into this point from the anonymous LinkedIn user. Enterprises are full of gorillas and whales when compared with individual mice. Where I want to go with that is, one of the buzz phrases I make fun of is ecosystem, because I argue that most ecosystems are actually solar systems, where the controlling vendor in that ecosystem shines like the sun. And the problem is who else stands out in the sun? The big SIs. And Maureen, when you talk about curiosity, I think the big thing a lot of enterprises are missing, if I were advising them on where to go next with this discussion, I would say start looking at smaller industry expert vendors that are not on your current radar screen, because there are so many smart folks. I mean, you saw Chris in the chat today, the stuff that you're working on. I know so many smaller vendors with that are full of a head of steam for solving these problems in new and novel ways. And I'm not saying that the big firms never have good methodologies and good ideas, but I think one of the best things enterprises could do is really open up that vendor list right now and say, we're at some major crossroads here. We need some fresh thinking on these topics. And I think that would go a long way towards charging the right internal culture, because one of the best things is to have your culture challenged a little bit. And I think independent thinkers with creative approaches and new solutions, and by the way, able to build IP, I think maybe more effectively than ever before, pay attention to those folks. That's what I got to say about that. What do you think?
Absolutely.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, we know, John, from the data practitioners that we've worked with on our own stuff, the smaller ones are the ones that really want to spend the time with you. They will get to know you inside out because they want to help you solve your problems, and they won't automatically put agentic on a label. In fact, they'll look at anything rather than putting agentic AI. So they'll use things like knowledge graphs, they'll use logic, they'll use other tools that are, still really well established, but don't need a shiny price tag on them.
Yeah, and speaking of which, I would probably do if folks want to get further into that comment, check out Neo4j's YouTube channel. I was just watching it today. They're doing a lot of super cool stuff with knowledge graphs and enterprise data. And I get excited about that stuff because it's a major deviation away from the frontier model thinking of a handful of frontier model companies kind of dictating how we're supposed to operate in the enterprise. And, that the first step is unplugging from that. And then I think you can find some better solutions. To the two of you, I'm going to implement a sound effect. Whoops, that's not the right sound effect. Let's try, how about this one?
Oh, that's a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you for bringing so much needed commentary and improving my thinking and so many others so much. I'm really glad the two of you were here. Thanks all for commenting. It was great to see you on the show, and we'll do it again.